In a small, quiet village by the sea, a young boy swallowed a strange fruit and made a promise to a one-armed pirate. He would gather a crew, find the greatest treasure in the world, and become the king of the pirates. Back then, no one knew his name, and the price on his head was nothing at all. By the end of his story, that same boy would be hunted for 3 billion coins and counted among the 4 most powerful pirates alive. This is the rise of Monkey D. Luffy, told from the very beginning. He never once chased power for its own sake. Every great leap he took came from one stubborn choice: to never abandon the people he loved, no matter the cost. Tonight, we follow that whole journey, step by step, from a borrowed straw hat to the awakening of a power hidden for hundreds of years. Welcome to Anabrain. Let's get started. Section 1. The Boy and the Straw Hat. Long before the world ever feared his name, there was a small, quiet village beside the sea. It sat at the very edge of a place called the East Blue, one of the 4 great oceans in this story. People called the village Fuchsia. Most days, almost nothing happened there. Fishing boats drifted out in the morning and came back in the evening. The grown-ups worked, the children played, and the sun went down over calm water. A person could be born in Fuchsia, grow old in Fuchsia, and never once feel the need to leave it. It was a soft, sleepy corner of the world, far away from anything dangerous. A boy lived in that village. His name was Monkey D. Luffy. He was around 7 years old, with a loud laugh, a gap in his front teeth, and a smile that took up most of his face. He could not sit still for more than a minute. He was always running somewhere, always asking questions, always getting into small trouble and then grinning his way out of it. To the adults of Fuchsia, he was just a happy, restless little kid. None of them could have guessed what he would one day grow into. Then one day, a pirate ship came into the harbor. The pirates who climbed off that ship were not cruel. They did not burn the village or steal from the people. They were loud and cheerful, and they liked to drink and laugh and tell wild stories at the little bar in town. Their leader was a young man with bright red hair. His name was Shanks. He had a calm, easy way about him. The kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and make them all feel like old friends. He carried himself like a man who had seen the whole world and found most of it funny. Shanks and his crew decided to use Fuchsia as a resting spot. They came and went over many months, more than a year in all, sailing off to sea and then returning to the same quiet bar. And every time they were in town, the small boy was there too, sitting at the counter, listening to every word. Luffy wanted, more than anything, to be one of them. He begged Shanks to take him along on the next voyage. Shanks always laughed and told him no, that the sea was no place for a child, that a kid who could not even swim well had no business on a pirate ship. This only made Luffy try harder. He wanted to prove he was tough enough. One day, to show he was not afraid of anything, he grabbed a knife and stabbed himself right under his left eye. It hurt terribly, and it left a scar he would carry for the rest of his life, a small mark just below his eye. Shanks and his crew were horrified. The boy thought he had proven his courage. The grown men thought he had nearly blinded himself for no reason at all. So Luffy stayed behind, day after day, sitting in the bar while the pirates told their tales. And it was in that bar that the first great turning point of his whole life happened. Almost by accident. On a table inside the bar sat a small chest that belonged to the pirates. Inside it was a strange purple fruit covered in odd, swirling patterns. Luffy, being hungry and curious the way little kids are, opened the chest and ate the fruit in a few quick bites. It tasted awful. He made a face and complained about it. And then the pirates came running, looking pale and shocked, because that fruit had not been an ordinary snack at all. It was a devil fruit. In this world, there are rare and mysterious fruits scattered across the seas. Anyone who eats one gains a strange power. The price for that power is steep, and it never goes away. From the moment a person eats a devil fruit, they lose the ability to swim forever. The ocean turns from a friend into an enemy. For someone who dreams of sailing across the world, that is a heavy thing to carry. The fruit Luffy had eaten was known as the gum-gum fruit. Its power was simple and, at first, more than a little silly. It turned his whole body into rubber. He could stretch his arms far out across a room. He could bounce off walls. He could puff out his cheeks and twist himself into shapes that should have hurt and did not. The pirate stared at the boy as he pulled his own mouth halfway across the bar, half laughing and half panicking, and they realized he had just swallowed something very valuable and lost his chance to ever swim. At the time, no one thought much of it beyond the danger. A rubber boy who could no longer swim seemed like an unlucky thing. maybe even a sad joke. What none of them knew, what the whole world would not learn for a very, very long time, was that this fruit held a secret far larger than anyone in that little bar could imagine. That secret would stay buried for decades. For now, it was just a power that made a small boy stretch. Things in Fuchsia did not stay peaceful for long after that. A group of mountain bandits, led by a rough and ugly man named Higuma, came down into the village and into the bar. Higuma was a bully who loved to throw his weight around. He insulted Shanks and his crew, poured drinks over them, smashed bottles, and dared them to do something about it. And here Shanks did something that surprised everyone, especially Luffy. He did not fight back. He stayed in his seat, smiled, and let the bandit say his ugly words and walk away. He even helped clean up the broken glass afterward, still smiling. Luffy was furious. He could not understand it. To him, a real man, a real pirate, would have stood up and fought. He shouted at Shanks for being a coward. Shanks only laughed gently and tried to explain that a few mean words were not worth spilling blood over. The boy did not accept that. In his young heart, he decided that strength meant never backing down, and he could not see why his hero had simply taken the insults and let them go. But the danger was not finished. Higuma the bandit came back, and this time he found Luffy alone. The boy, full of pride and anger, mouthed off to the bandit just as he had seen the pirates do. And Higuma was not a man who let things slide. He grabbed Luffy, and to escape the crew, he dragged the boy out onto the open sea, far from shore, far from anyone who could help. That was the worst possible place for Luffy to be. A boy who could no longer swim, out on the deep water, in the hands of a man who wanted him gone. And then it got worse. A giant sea monster rose up out of the ocean, an enormous beast big enough to swallow a boat whole. It went after the bandit, and then it turned toward the small boy floating helplessly in the waves. In that moment, when everything looked lost, Shanks arrived. He reached Luffy in the water just as the monster came down on them. He pulled the boy close and held him safe. The beast caught Shanks instead, and when it finally backed away, the pirate captain was missing his left arm. Blood spread across the water. The monster, frightened off by the look in Shanks' eyes, vanished back into the deep. Shanks held the crying child against his chest with his one remaining arm. Luffy was sobbing, screaming that it was his fault, that Shanks had lost his arm because of him. The captain just looked down at him and smiled through the pain. An arm was a small thing, he told the boy. He was alive, and that was what mattered. There was no anger in his voice at all, only relief that the child was safe. Luffy never forgot that. A grown man, a fearsome pirate, had given up part of his own body without a second of regret, just to save a loud little kid who had caused him nothing but trouble. The lesson sank deep into the boy, deeper than any words ever could. Real strength, he began to understand, was not only about fighting, it was also about what a person was willing to give for the people they cared about. Soon after, the time came for Shanks and his crew to leave Fuchsia for good. The ship was loaded. The goodbyes were said. Luffy stood on the dock, trying very hard not to cry, and told Shanks that he was not asking to come along anymore. Instead, he made a promise. One day he would gather his own crew. One day he would sail out and find the greatest treasure in all the world, the treasure left behind by the Pirate King himself. One day he would become the king of the pirates, the freest man on the seas. Years before all this, there had been a man named Gol D. Roger, the only pirate ever to sail across the entire world and conquer it. Before he died, he left behind a single, enormous treasure somewhere at the end of the most dangerous sea of all. He called it the One Piece. Whoever found it would earn the title that Roger once held, the King of the Pirates. Every pirate in the world dreamed of it, and now a 7-year-old boy in a sleepy village was promising, out loud, that the treasure would be his. Shanks did not laugh at him this time. He looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he reached up and took off his most precious belonging, the worn straw hat he always wore on his head. That hat had not always been his. It had once belonged to a great and famous pirate that Shanks had sailed with long ago, and Shanks had carried it for years like something sacred. He placed it gently on Luffy's small head. It was far too big for him and slipped down over his eyes. The hat was a promise, Shanks told him. Luffy was to keep it safe and grow strong. And one day, when he had become a great pirate in his own right, he would give it back. They would meet again. Until that day, the straw hat belonged to Luffy. Then the red-haired captain climbed aboard his ship, waved his one arm, and sailed away over the horizon. Luffy stood on the shore, the hat pulled down over his face, tears running down his cheeks, watching the only hero he had ever known disappear into the distance. From that day on, the straw hat was never just a hat. It was the weight of a promise resting on a boy's head. It was a reminder of the man who had bled for him and believed in him, and it was a goal pointed straight at the horizon. Everything Luffy would ever do, every fight, every storm, every impossible choice, would lead back to that small moment on the dock and the simple vow attached to it. Become great enough to return the hat. Become great enough to be free. A small boy in a quiet village, a stretchy power he barely understood, and a borrowed hat that meant everything. That was the whole beginning. There were no crowds yet, no enemies, no bounty on his head, no kingdoms watching his every step. There was only a dream that most people would have called foolish, and a child stubborn enough to chase it for the rest of his life. Luffy spent the next 10 years in Fuchsia, growing taller, growing stronger, training himself in the small ways a village boy could. He kept the hat, he kept the promise. And the whole time, the sea waited for him, wide and open and full of things he could not yet imagine. When he finally turned 17, he built a tiny boat, climbed aboard with almost nothing to his name, and pushed off from the only home he had ever known. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. He set out completely alone. No crew, no map worth trusting, no real plan beyond the dream itself. The wider world had never heard of him and had no reason to care. But that was about to change faster than anyone expected, because the first time Luffy stepped off his little boat and into the lives of strangers, he would leave a mark so large that the most powerful people in the world would be forced, for the very first time, to learn his name. Section 2. The First Crew and the First Bounty. The sea was wide and empty the day Luffy left home. His boat was small, barely big enough for one person, and he had no map, no money worth counting, and no crew. He had a straw hat, a stretchy body he was still learning to use, and a promise he meant to keep. For a boy who dreamed of becoming the king of the pirates, it was the smallest possible beginning. Yet he sat in that little boat and grinned at the horizon as if the whole world already belonged to him. A pirate king needs a crew, and Luffy had none. So the first part of his journey became a search for people, the friends who would one day sail with him across the most dangerous waters in the world. He did not pick them the way most captains pick a crew. He did not look for the strongest or the most famous. He looked for people whose hearts pointed in the same direction as his, and he asked them, plainly and without doubt, to come along. The first person who truly mattered was a swordsman named Roronoa Zoro. When Luffy found him, Zoro was tied to a post in the yard of a town run by cruel men who wore the uniform of the law. The man in charge there was a proud officer who hurt the people he was supposed to protect, and Zoro had been left to starve in the sun as a punishment. Most travelers would have looked away. Luffy walked right up to him instead. He had heard that Zoro was a fearsome fighter, and he wanted that fighter on his crew. Zoro had a dream of his own, a promise made years ago to a lost friend. He wanted to become the greatest swordsman the world had ever seen. Luffy freed him. The two of them brought down the cruel officer together, and from that day forward, Zoro stood at Luffy's side. He became the first member of the crew, and the one who would guard the captain's back through every storm to come. 2 was better than 1, but it was still far from a crew. The next to enter Luffy's life was a young woman named Nami. She was clever, quick, and a brilliant reader of the sea and sky, the kind of person who could feel a storm coming before a single cloud appeared. She was also a thief who hated pirates with everything in her. She robbed them, tricked them, and wanted nothing to do with their kind. When she first crossed paths with Luffy, in a town being terrorized by a strange, clown-like pirate, she saw him only as another fool to use and leave behind. Luffy, for his part, decided almost at once that he wanted her as his navigator. He did not push or argue. He simply kept showing up, kept helping, and kept being the same open, honest person no matter how many times she lied to him. A liar of a different kind joined soon after. His name was Usopp, a skinny boy famous in his village for telling huge, ridiculous stories. He would run through the streets shouting that pirates were coming just to get a reaction, and no one believed a word he said. But under all the tall tales, Usopp was brave when it counted. When real danger came to his village, in the shape of a wicked man hiding behind a kind face, Usopp stood and fought to protect a sick girl he cared about. Luffy and the others helped him win that fight, and the grateful girl gave them something they badly needed: a real ship. They named her the Going Merry. For the first time, Luffy's dream had a proper deck under it, and Usopp climbed aboard as the crew's sharpshooter, the one who fired from a distance and kept everyone laughing along the way. Then came the cook. On a floating restaurant out in the middle of the ocean, a place where hungry sailors and dangerous pirates ate side by side, Luffy met a sharp-tongued young man named Sanji. Sanji fought with his legs to keep his hands safe for cooking, and he carried a dream as strange and beautiful as anyone else's. He wanted to find a legendary sea, said to hold every kind of fish in the world, a place most people swore did not exist. He was rude, proud, and kind in ways he tried to hide. And he had a deep belief that no hungry person should ever be turned away, even an enemy. While the crew were at that restaurant, Zoro asked to test himself against the strongest swordsman alive, a quiet, fearsome man with eyes like a hawk. The fight was over almost before it began. Zoro was beaten badly, shown in a single afternoon just how enormous the gap was between where he stood and where he wanted to be. He did not crumble under it. He swore, with blood on the deck, that he would never lose again. And Luffy heard that promise and believed it. Sanji, after a hard goodbye to the old man who had raised him, joined the crew as its cook. 5 friends now sailed together on the Going Merry. They were strong, they were loyal, and they were starting to feel like a real crew. But the journey through the East Blue was not finished, and the hardest part of it had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. It was wrapped up in the navigator, Nami, and the secret she had been carrying alone. Nami left the crew without warning, taking the ship and sailing back to a place she had sworn never to return to. The truth, when it came out, was heavy. Years before, when Nami was only a small child, her home had been a peaceful village on a quiet island. A band of fishmen, sea people far stronger than ordinary humans, had stormed in and taken the island for themselves. Their leader was a huge, cruel creature named Arlong, who looked down on humans as weak and worthless. The villagers were forced to pay him to be allowed to keep living. On the day he arrived, the woman who had taken Nami and her older sister in and raised them as her own, a former soldier named Belle Mare, had only enough money to save 2 people, not 3. She used it to protect her 2 girls and gave up her own life to do it. Arlong took her from them right in front of the children. Arlong had noticed something rare in young Nami. She could draw maps of the sea better than almost anyone alive. So instead of harming her, he forced her to work for him, drawing charts for his crew. He made her a cold promise. If she could bring him 100 million coins, an impossible mountain of money, he would sell her village its freedom and let her people go. For years, Nami did the only thing she could. She stole. She tricked pirates and gathered every coin she could, hiding her real heart behind the face of a selfish thief. All so she could one day buy back the home Arlong had stolen. She had almost reached the full amount when a dishonest officer of the law, working secretly with Arlong, seized her savings and left her with nothing. Years of pain, gone in a single afternoon. That was the moment that broke her. When Luffy and the others finally caught up to her, they found her surrounded by enemies and grief, stabbing at her own tattooed arm in fury and despair, trying to cut away the mark Arlong had forced on her. She had pushed everyone away for so long because she did not believe anyone would truly stay. And then, with nothing left and no pride to protect, she turned to Luffy, the captain she had lied to again and again, and quietly asked him for help. Luffy did not give a speech. He walked over to her without a word. Then he took the straw hat off his own head, the hat Shanks had given him, the most precious thing he owned, and he placed it gently on hers. With that simple act, he told her everything. She was his friend. He would not leave. And the people who had hurt her were about to learn what that meant. He turned and walked straight toward Arlong Park, the stone fortress where the fishmen ruled, ready to tear the whole thing down. The fight was brutal. Arlong was monstrously strong, far stronger than anything Luffy had faced before, and he fought with the certainty of a creature who had never lost. He threw Luffy around, held him underwater where the rubber boy could not swim, and laughed at the idea that a human could ever beat him. Luffy refused to stay down. Every time he was knocked back, he stood again, until at last he broke through Arlong's defenses and brought the whole fortress crashing down on the fishman's head. The years of fear ended in that moment. The village was free. Nami, weeping, finally believed that her home was truly hers again, and she came back to the crew not as a hostage to her past, but as a friend who had chosen her future. She returned the hat to Luffy and took her place as the crew's navigator for real. The world had not been watching the East Blue. It was a far corner of the map, a place the powerful rarely bothered with. But word of what happened at Arlong Park traveled, because Arlong had been a known and feared name, and the boy who toppled him had not. Not long after, as the crew sailed on, a newspaper drifted into Nami's hands, and a folded piece of paper slipped out of it. On that paper was Luffy's face, and above it a number. A reward of 30 million coins had been placed on his head. He had become the most wanted pirate in the entire East Blue. For Luffy, that paper was a thrill, a sign that his journey was truly beginning. He laughed and held it up like a prize. The grown-ups around him understood it differently. A bounty was a warning. It meant the people in charge of the world had taken notice. It meant that bounty hunters and rival pirates would now come looking, drawn by the money and the chance to make a name by taking him down. The quiet boy from the sleepy village had stepped into the light, and the light came with a target. 30 million was a small number compared to what waited ahead, but it was the first rung on a ladder that would climb higher than anyone could have guessed. It marked the exact moment the world first learned that a pirate named Monkey D. Luffy existed, and decided he was worth catching. From here, his name would never again be unknown. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With a crew, a ship, a navigator who could read the sea, and a price on his head, Luffy turned the Going Merry toward the entrance of a far greater and far more terrible ocean. The East Blue had been the calm shallows, the place where children learned to wade. Beyond it lay a sea so dangerous that most pirates who entered it were never heard from again. A place of monsters and madmen, and powers that made Arlong look small. And somewhere in those waters waited a man the world's own government had not only failed to stop, but had chosen instead to make a partner, a ruler hiding behind a crown of sand, whose downfall would push the number on Luffy's head higher than the boy ever imagined possible. Section 3. The Warlord of the Sand. The sea beyond the East Blue had a name that pirates spoke with both hunger and fear. They called it the Grand Line, a great ribbon of ocean that wrapped all the way around the world. It was the only road to the greatest treasure of all, and it was the most dangerous water any sailor could choose. The weather there changed without warning. The currents made no sense. Compasses spun in useless circles, because the islands themselves pulled at them in strange ways. For every crew brave enough to enter, many were never seen again. To even get in, a ship had to climb a mountain of water and ride it back down the other side. Luffy steered the Going Merry up that impossible slope and down into the deadly sea, laughing the whole way. Before all that, the crew had passed through the last town of the East Blue, a place called Log Town. It was an ordinary port with one extraordinary piece of history. The Pirate King, Gold D. Roger, the man who had once owned the very hat on Luffy's head, had been born there. He had also been put to death there, on a tall platform in the center of town, many years before. Luffy climbed that platform and stood on the exact spot where the king of the pirates had died. For a boy chasing Roger's old dream, it was a strange and powerful thing to stand where the dream had ended. He barely escaped the town with his life when old enemies and the law closed in at once. But escape he did, and the crew sailed on toward the mountain and the sea beyond it. The Grand Line did not waste time testing them. Almost as soon as they arrived, the crew became tangled up in the troubles of a young woman who had been traveling in secret. Her real name was Vivi, and she was a princess. Her home was a desert kingdom called Alabasta, a land of sand and sun far across the new sea. Her country was falling apart, and she had spent years risking her life undercover to find out who was behind it. What she had discovered terrified her. The man pulling her kingdom toward ruin was hiding in plain sight, dressed as a hero, trusted by the most powerful people in the world. His name was Crocodile. To understand why Crocodile was so dangerous, you have to understand a strange deal that ran through this whole world. The government that ruled most of the seas had a small group of fearsome pirates it had chosen to work with instead of fight. These pirates were allowed to keep doing as they pleased, and in return they helped keep other pirates in line. People called them warlords. They were criminals wearing the mask of allies, and the government looked the other way at almost everything they did. Crocodile was one of them. To the public, he was a celebrated protector of Alabasta, a strong man who kept the peace. In truth, he had spent years secretly tearing the kingdom apart so that he could take it for himself. His plan was patient and cruel. He had quietly caused the rain to stop falling, so that the desert kingdom dried up and the people began to starve. Then he made sure the suffering people blamed their own king for it. Anger spread, a rebellion grew, and a civil war began to boil, exactly as Crocodile wanted. He planned to let the country burn, step in as the savior, and seize the throne while everyone was too busy fighting to notice the hand behind it all. Vivi was racing home to stop the war before her people destroyed each other over a lie. She could not do it alone, and so she asked Luffy and his crew for help. On the long way to the desert, the crew gained a new member, found in the coldest place imaginable. Nami fell terribly ill with a high fever, and the only hope of a cure lay on a frozen island ringed by snowy mountains. There, after a hard climb, Luffy and Sanji found a doctor unlike any other. It was a small reindeer named Tony Chopper, who had eaten a devil fruit that let him think, speak, and walk like a person, and change his shape at will. Chopper had spent his whole life as an outcast. The other reindeer feared his strange blue nose and pushed him away, and the humans who saw him walking and talking ran in terror. He had only ever known one true friend, a kind old man who taught him medicine and then passed away. When Luffy met this lonely little creature and saw how gifted and gentle he was, he did the simplest thing in the world. He asked Chopper to join the crew. Chopper, who had never belonged anywhere, finally found a place. He climbed aboard the ship as its doctor, and the crew grew to 6. When they finally reached Alabasta, the kingdom was right at the edge of disaster. The rebel army and the king's army were marching toward each other, and once they clashed, thousands would die for nothing. Crocodile's trap was nearly sprung. The crew threw themselves into stopping it. They fought their way through the desert, scattered across a city in chaos, racing against a clock that was almost out of time. Vivi stood before the two armies and tried with all her heart to make them stop, screaming that they were being used, that the real enemy was someone neither side could see. While Vivi fought to save her people with words, Luffy went after the man behind it all. The fight against Crocodile was the hardest and most painful Luffy had ever faced. Crocodile's devil fruit had turned his body into sand. He could crumble into dust whenever a punch came near, so that fists passed right through him and hit nothing. Worse, he could pull every drop of water out of whatever he touched, drying it to powder. The first time the two of them fought, Crocodile barely had to try. He toyed with Luffy, dried out his body, ran him through, and left him for dead in the sand. Certain the boy would never get up. Luffy was saved only by luck and the help of a stranger, and dragged back from the edge of death. Most people would have stayed down after that. Luffy got up and went back for more. The second time he lost again, dropped into a tank of water with no way out, left to drown by a man who had grown bored of him, and still he climbed back. By the third fight, Luffy had finally worked out the secret. Sand turns hard and solid when it gets wet, so if he could only soak Crocodile through, the man would lose his crumbling, untouchable trick and become as solid and breakable as anyone else. Luffy used water and even his own blood to wet the warlord down, and once Crocodile could no longer slip away as dust, Luffy hit him with everything he had left. The final blow sent the proud warlord smashing up through solid rock, beaten at last. The kingdom was saved in the same hour. Vivi could not stop the armies herself, but the crew managed to reveal the truth in time, and a sudden rain, the first the land had seen in years, broke over the desert and cooled the fighting. The war ended. The lie fell apart. Crocodile, the great hero of Alabasta, was exposed in front of the whole world as the villain who had nearly murdered his own country. For Luffy, this was the first time he had brought down one of the government's own chosen pirates. Beating Arlong had made him known. Beating a warlord made him a real threat. The government could not allow people to see that a teenage pirate had toppled one of their trusted enforcers, because it would make them look weak and make the warlords look like a bad idea. So they hid the truth. They stripped Crocodile of his title and shipped him off to the most feared prison in the world. But they handed the credit for his defeat to a Marine officer, keeping Luffy's name out of it on purpose. Even buried, though, the deed was too big to fully hide. Quietly, the price on Luffy's head was raised. It climbed from 30 million all the way to 100 million, more than 3 times what it had been. The boy was no longer a small-time nuisance from a faraway sea. He was someone the powerful had begun to truly worry about. There was also a quiet goodbye and a quiet hello at the end of it all. Vivi, the princess, had become one of the crew's dearest friends, and part of her longed to keep sailing with them. But she was a princess, and her broken kingdom needed her. She chose to stay behind and help her people heal, and the crew sailed away carrying the memory of her, rather than the girl herself. In her place, someone new slipped aboard. A calm, mysterious woman who had once worked at Crocodile's side now had nowhere left to go. The whole world had hunted her since she was a child, for a secret she carried, a piece of forbidden knowledge the government would kill to keep buried. Luffy had refused to let her throw her life away, and so she joined the crew, bringing her shadowed past along with her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Kingdom of Sand faded behind them, and the bounty on Luffy's head sat at 100 million as the Going Merry pushed deeper into the strange new sea. Each island they reached would be wilder than the last, but the woman they had just taken in carried a danger heavier than any storm. The secret she held was something the rulers of the world had spent 800 years trying to erase, and they would stop at nothing to silence the one person alive who could read it. To keep her, Luffy would soon have to do something no pirate in living memory had ever dared. Something so bold that the entire government of the world would be forced to answer it. He would have to declare war on them all. Section 4. War on the whole world. The woman who joined Luffy's crew after the Desert Kingdom was named Nico Robin. She was quiet, graceful, and far older in her sorrows than her calm face let on. From the very start, she expected the crew to throw her away the moment she became inconvenient, because that was the only thing the world had ever done to her. She had learned, over a long and lonely life, that letting people close only led to losing them. So she smiled, helped where she could, and kept a corner of her heart locked tight, waiting for the day these new friends would turn on her like everyone before them. What made Robin so hunted was a single rare gift. Scattered across the world were a handful of ancient blocks of stone, carved long ago with the true history of a forgotten age. 800 years before Luffy was born, something enormous had happened. Something the rulers of the world wanted erased so completely that they had spent 8 centuries hiding it. They had wiped that stretch of time out of every book and every record. The only clues left were on those stones, written in letters almost no one alive could read. Robin could read them. She had learned the lost language as a child, and that made her the single most dangerous person in the world in the eyes of the government, because she could uncover the one truth they had killed to bury. For a long while, the crew sailed on without trouble finding them. They reached a city built on the water, a sprawling place of canals and master shipbuilders. They had come for an honest reason. Their faithful ship, the Going Merry, the little vessel that had carried them since the early days, had been damaged again and again over countless battles and storms. When the shipwrights examined her, they delivered news the crew did not want to hear. The Merry was broken beyond saving. Her backbone had cracked, and no repair in the world could make her seaworthy again. She had given everything she had, and she was dying. That news tore at the crew, especially at Usopp, who loved the little ship more than anyone, and had patched her with his own hands 100 times. He could not accept letting her go. The argument grew into a real and painful fight, and in his grief, Usopp challenged his own captain and then left the crew entirely. It was the worst kind of wound, the kind that comes from people who care too much rather than too little, and it left everyone hollow. Into that raw, broken moment, the real danger struck. Robin vanished. At first, it looked as if she had betrayed them and joined the enemy. The truth, when it came out, was the opposite. A secret squad of killers, men who worked in shadow for the highest powers of the world, had finally caught up to her. They had been hiding among the friendly shipbuilders all along, wearing ordinary faces. They told Robin a simple, terrible thing. If she came with them quietly to be silenced forever, they would spare her crew. If she resisted, the government would call down its fleet and erase Luffy and everyone he loved from existence. Robin, believing she was unwanted anyway, chose to walk to her own death to keep her friends alive. She let them take her, and she told the crew nothing, so they would not throw their lives away trying to stop it. Luffy and the others learned the truth too late to catch her at the city, but not too late to chase her. The killers were taking Robin to a place called Enies Lobby, an island fortress that served as the very heart of the world government's power. It was a stronghold ringed by soldiers, a place from which almost no prisoner ever returned. To go there as enemies was something close to suicide. Most pirates would not have dreamed of it. Luffy did not hesitate for even a breath. One of his own had been taken, and that settled the matter completely. Before the storming of the fortress, the story of why Robin expected to die at last came clear. She had grown up on a small island of scholars, gentle people who loved learning above all things, and who had quietly worked to read the forbidden stones. When the government discovered what they were studying, the answer was monstrous. They sent a fleet and wiped the entire island off the map. Scholars, books, families, and all. Robin, only a small child of 8, was the lone survivor. From that day, she carried a price on her head, hunted across the seas before she was even old enough to understand why. For 20 years, she ran. Every group that took her in eventually used her, betrayed her, or tried to collect the reward. She had been alone, with no place and no people for almost her whole life. By the time Luffy met her, she had stopped believing that a person like her was even allowed to wish for a future. The crew fought their way onto Eni's lobby and tore through everything in their path to reach her. At last, they stood within sight of one another. Robin held high above on a great tower, the crew far below across a wide gap, soldiers swarming everywhere. And here, Robin did the thing she had always done. She told them to leave her. She said she had been born into a world that had never wanted her, that her life had been one long mistake, and that they should save themselves and forget about her. She had carried that belief like a stone in her chest for 20 years. Luffy answered her without speeches. He turned to his friend, the one who had left the crew and who now stood among them again, his face hidden behind a simple mask and a made-up hero name so he could fight beside them without admitting he had come back. Luffy gave him a single order. High above the fortress flew the great flag of the world government, the symbol of the most powerful force on the planet, the mark that ruled every sea and bowed to no one. Luffy told his masked friend to burn it down. A shot rang out, and the enemy's flag tore apart and fell in flames. It was the loudest message a pirate could ever send. Burning that flag told the entire world that Luffy and his crew now stood against the whole government. Every soldier, every ship, every ruler, all of it. For the sake of one woman, they refused to abandon. There was no taking it back. With that single act, Luffy declared war on the most powerful organization in the world, and he did it gladly. Then Luffy shouted up to Robin and asked her what she truly wanted. Not what she thought she deserved. Not what the world had told her. What she wanted. And Robin, the woman who had spent 2 decades certain that wishing to live was a crime, finally broke. She cried out that she wanted to live. She begged them to take her out to sea with them. After 20 years of running and hiding and waiting to die, she allowed herself, for the first time, to want a future. That cry was the real heart of the whole battle. Everything after it was just the work of making it come true. Making it come true was no small thing, because the strongest of the government's killers still stood in the way. His name was Rob Lucci, and he was the deadliest fighter Luffy had ever faced. Lucci had eaten a devil fruit that let him turn into a powerful beast, a great spotted cat, and his strikes could punch clean through stone walls. Their fight was long and savage. To win it, Luffy reached deep and pulled out new powers he had been quietly developing. He found a way to speed up the flow of his own body until he moved almost too fast for the eye to follow, steam rising off his skin from the effort. He found another way to pump air into himself and blow his fists and limbs up to a giant size, so that a single punch carried the weight of a wrecking ball. He pushed himself past the edge of his own strength, took terrible damage, and kept getting up. In the end, with one final enormous blow, Luffy drove Lucci into the ground and brought the great assassin down. Saving Robin was one, but escaping the island was a different fight. The government, furious that its fortress had been breached, called down its ultimate weapon. It summoned an overwhelming fleet of warships, the kind of force used to erase an entire island and everyone standing on it, friend or foe, no questions asked. The same horror that had destroyed Robin's home as a child was now aimed at the crew. Cannon fire rained down. The island began to crumble into the sea. The crew was trapped, exhausted, and out of room to run. In that last, desperate moment, the Going Merry came back. The little ship that should not have been able to sail, the ship the crew had wept over and thought lost, appeared through the smoke one final time. No one had brought her. She had come on her own, somehow, to carry her crew to safety, as she had always done. The Merry pulled them out of the burning island and through the deadly fleet to open water. And then, her last task finished, she finally fell apart for good. The crew gave her the farewell she had earned, watching the ship that had been their first true home drift away in flames, thanking her through their tears for every mile she had carried them. Even Usopp, who had fought to save her, understood at last that the kindest thing was to let her rest. A new ship came into their lives soon after, larger and stronger than the Merry, built by a powerful shipwright who had ended up tangled in the whole affair and chose to join the crew himself. They named the new vessel the Thousand Sunny, and she would carry them into far rougher seas than the Mary had ever known. When the dust of Enies lobby settled, the world reacted exactly as the government had feared. A pirate had broken into their fortress, beaten their best killer, burned their flag, snatched away their most wanted prisoner, and sailed off alive. Such a thing could not be hidden. The price on Luffy's head leapt again, this time all the way to 300 million. His crew earned bounties of their own as well, their faces now posted across the seas. They had crossed a line that few ever crossed and lived. From this point forward, Luffy was not merely a strong pirate or a beater of warlords. He was a declared enemy of the entire world. A young man the rulers of the planet now wanted gone at any cost. Robin sailed on with them, no longer running, no longer waiting to be thrown away. She had a crew, a future, and a captain who had set the whole world on fire rather than lose her. The crew was bigger, stronger, and more wanted than ever as the Thousand Sunny carried them deeper along the Grand Line toward its halfway point. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the deeper they sailed, the closer they came to the strangest and cruelest part of this whole world. A place where the rules bent in ways even Luffy had never seen. There lived a small group of people so powerful that kings knelt before them, and the law itself looked the other way at anything they did. They were treated as living gods, untouchable, allowed to do whatever they pleased to anyone beneath them. Luffy was about to meet one of these so-called gods face to face, and when he saw what one of them did to a friend, he would do the one thing no ordinary person on the seas would ever dare. He would raise his fist and strike a god of the world right across the face. Section 5. The Day He Struck a God. The journey toward the middle of the Grand Line carried the crew through one more strange and frightening place before the world changed for them. It was a giant ship-shaped island wrapped in thick fog, a haunted spot ruled by another of the government's chosen pirates. This warlord had a chilling power. He could steal the shadows of living people and stuff them into corpses, building an army of mindless puppets that obeyed his every command. The crew fought their way through the fog and the monsters and finally brought the shadow thief down, freeing all the shadows he had stolen. In that haunted place, they met someone unforgettable. He was a tall, living skeleton in a fine old coat, with a wild afro and a gentle, joking manner. His name was Brook. Long ago, he had been a musician on a pirate crew, and when his whole crew died, a devil fruit had pulled his spirit back into his bones, leaving him alive but utterly alone. For 50 years, Brook had drifted by himself, a lonely skeleton with no one to talk to, holding on only because of a promise to an old friend. Half a century of solitude had not broken his kindness. When Luffy invited him to come along, Brook wept tears he had no eyes to cry with and joined as the crew's musician. The crew now numbered 9, a full and lively family, and they set their course for the halfway point of the world. That halfway point was a place called the Sabaody Archipelago. It was unlike anywhere they had been, a cluster of enormous trees growing out of the sea, so tall they seemed to touch the sky, with bubbles of every size floating up through the air. It was beautiful and busy and crowded with people from across the world. Sabaody was the last stop before the truly deadly half of the Grand Line, the second half where only the strongest pirates survived. To go on, ships had to be wrapped in a special coating so they could sail down beneath the waves. And so the crew came to Sabaody to have the Thousand Sunny made ready for the depths. Under all that beauty, Sabaody hid something rotten. It was one of the great centers of the slave trade, a place where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. The buyers who mattered most, the ones everyone else feared and obeyed, were a small group of people unlike any other in the world. They were called the Celestial Dragons. They were the descendants of the families who had founded the world government long ago, and the world treated them as living gods. They could do absolutely anything they wished. They could take any person they liked as a slave, shoot anyone who annoyed them, and walk away without a single consequence. They thought so little of ordinary people that they wore round glass helmets over their heads, just so they would not have to breathe the same air as everyone beneath them. To lay even a finger on one of them was the gravest crime imaginable. Harm a celestial dragon, and the government would send its very strongest forces to wipe you out. The crew might have passed through Sabaody without ever touching that horror, except that it reached out and grabbed 2 of their friends. While traveling, the crew had become close to a cheerful mermaid named Cammy and a reformed fishman named Hachin, who had once been an enemy long ago and was now a friend.
Cammy was kidnapped by slave traders and dragged off to be sold at a great auction house, paraded onto a stage in front of a crowd of cruel, wealthy buyers.
The crew rushed to save her, racing through the streets to reach the auction before the bidding closed. Sitting in the audience that day, among the eager buyers, was one of the celestial dragons. His name was Saint Charlos, a fat, spoiled creature who treated every living thing around him as a toy. When the crew burst in, Hachin, terrified for Cammy, revealed that he was a fishman and begged for her safety. The celestial dragon, disgusted that a fishman dared to speak to him, calmly drew a gun and shot Hachin down where he stood, as casually as a person might swat a fly. He fully expected nothing to happen to him for it, because nothing ever had. Luffy did not think. He did not weigh the danger or count the cost. He saw his friend shot down for sport by a smug, cruel man. And he crossed the entire room in a fury, climbed onto the stage, and drove his fist straight into the face of the celestial dragon. The blow knocked the so-called god flat, out cold, sprawled across the auction floor in front of a horrified, frozen crowd. The whole room went silent. Everyone there understood exactly what they had just seen. A pirate had struck a celestial dragon. The one thing no person on Earth was ever supposed to do. There would be no hiding it, no smoothing it over, no escaping it. The full might of the world's navy would now descend on Sabaody to punish the boy who had dared. Luffy knew it too, and he did not care in the slightest. A friend had been hurt, and to him, that was the only fact that mattered. It was the very same lesson Shanks had carved into him as a child. The belief that real strength means standing up for the people you love, no matter what it costs you. That single punch lit a fire across the whole island. The Navy responded just as everyone feared, sending an overwhelming force to crush the crew. One of the Navy's very strongest commanders arrived in person, a terrifying man who could turn his own body into pure light, moving and striking at impossible speed. Alongside him came rows of human-shaped weapons, powerful soldiers built to look almost like men, able to fire blinding beams from their bodies. Against such enemies, the crew suddenly felt very small. They fought hard. The other young pirates who had gathered at Sabaody, a famous group of 11 rising rookies who all happened to be there at once, fought too. Each of them feared in their own right. Even together, all of them combined were like children standing against a tidal wave. The gap between Luffy and the true powers of the world was laid bare in the cruelest way. He had beaten warlords and burned the government's flag, and here he learned that there were still mountains far above him he could not yet hope to climb. In the middle of the chaos, an unlikely helper stepped in. An older man, calm and unhurried, who had been working quietly as one of the craftsmen who coded ships, suddenly revealed power enough to hold off the Navy's lightspeed commander. This old man was named Rayleigh, and he carried an enormous secret. Long ago, he had been the right-hand man of Gol D. Roger himself, the Pirate King, the very man whose hat now sat on Luffy's head. The first mate of the King of the Pirates had been hiding in plain sight at Sabaody all this time, and now he chose to help Roger's young successor. Even with Rayleigh's help, the crew could not win, and the worst was still coming. A warlord arrived at Sabaody, an enormous, quiet man with a strange and terrible power. With a single touch of his great paw-like hands, he could send anything flying across the entire world, hurling a person thousands of miles in an instant to some far, unknown place. One by one, he began to touch the members of the crew, and one by one, they vanished, blasted off to distant corners of the globe. Luffy watched in horror as his friends disappeared in front of his eyes, one after another, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He screamed for them, reached for them, and they were gone all the same. At last, the great hand touched Luffy too, and the boy who had punched a god was thrown away across the world like all the rest. In a matter of minutes, the crew that had fought through so much together was scattered to 9 separate corners of the earth, alone. It was the lowest moment Luffy had ever known. He had not been beaten in a fair fight, so much as swept aside like a leaf, torn away from every single person he loved in one stroke. There was a hidden mercy in it that no one understood at the time, for the strange warlord had reasons of his own that would only become clear much later. In the moment, though, it felt like nothing but ruin. No new bounty came from Sabaody, no triumphant new number on a poster. What Luffy gained there was harder and heavier than any reward. He learned beyond any doubt how vast the world above him truly was, and he tasted real, helpless defeat for the first time since setting sail. He had struck a god and survived it. He had proven in front of the whole world that his spirit would not bend to anyone, no matter how powerful, no matter how feared. And he had been broken open in the process, separated from his crew, flung alone into a strange land far from everything he knew. The punch at Sabaody would echo for years as one of the boldest things any pirate had ever done. The price he paid for it was the scattering of his family and a long, hard lesson about how much further he still had to go. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Thrown across the sea, dizzy and battered, Luffy landed in a distant place he had never seen, surrounded by strangers, with no idea where any of his crew had gone. He wanted nothing more than to find them and put his family back together. The world, though, had a far crueler plan waiting for him. Word would soon reach him of his beloved older brother, a man he had grown up beside and loved with his whole heart. That brother had been captured by the Navy and was about to be put to death in public, in front of the entire world. And the moment Luffy heard it, he would forget his own safety completely and throw himself headfirst into the deepest, darkest prison in the world. And from there, into the largest and most terrible war the seas had ever seen. Section 6. The War That Broke Him. The place Luffy landed after being flung across the world was an island unlike any other, home to only women, ruled by a powerful warrior queen. She was one of the government's chosen warlords, beautiful and feared, and she carried a deep hatred for men and for the world nobles who had once enslaved her as a child. At first, she wanted nothing to do with the strange boy who had crashed into her kingdom. Over time, though, his honesty and his fearless heart won her over completely, and she fell hopelessly in love with him. Luffy barely noticed her feelings, his mind always somewhere else, but he gladly accepted her help because he had just read something in a newspaper that turned his blood to ice. His older brother was going to be executed. To understand what that meant to Luffy, you have to understand who his brother was. His name was Ace, and the two of them had grown up together in the wild forests of a mountain as boys.
They were not raised by gentle parents in a cozy home.
They were left in the care of a rough band of mountain bandits who took them in, and they ran wild through the trees, fighting, hunting, and toughening each other up from the time they were small. There had been a third boy with them in those days as well, another brother of the heart, and the three of them had sworn to be a family by sharing a quiet toast together, promising to look out for one another no matter what. That third brother had been lost in a terrible accident when they were still children, a loss that scarred both Luffy and Ace deeply and bound the two survivors even closer. Ace was the older one, the steadier one, the kind of big brother who scolded Luffy and protected him in the same breath, and he had set out to sea before Luffy ever did.
Out on the water, Ace had risen high, becoming a trusted commander in the crew of the most powerful pirate alive at the time, a towering old giant of a man called Whitebeard, one of the 4 strongest pirates ruling the deadly half of the sea. Ace also carried a heavy secret. He was the true son of the dead Pirate King, the very man whose hat Luffy wore. That bloodline made him someone the government wanted erased from the world more than almost anyone. Ace had chased after a treacherous pirate who had murdered one of his own crewmates. That hunt ended in disaster. The traitor overpowered Ace, captured him, and handed him over to the Navy to win himself a place among the warlords. Now the Navy planned to put Ace to death in public, in front of the whole world, partly to crush the spirit of every pirate watching, and partly to lure his powerful captain into a trap. The moment Luffy understood all of this, nothing else existed for him. His scattered crew, his own safety, his dream, all of it fell away. His brother was in danger, and Luffy would tear the world apart to reach him. The first wall in his way was a prison, the most feared prison that had ever been built. It sat deep beneath the sea, layer upon layer of cells sinking down into darkness, each level worse than the one above. The worst criminals in the world were buried in its lowest depths, and no one was meant to ever break in or out. Luffy charged into it anyway, with almost no plan beyond reaching his brother. Inside, he gathered the strangest band of helpers imaginable, a mix of old enemies and odd strangers who, for their own reasons, threw in their lot with him. Together they fought their way down through the prison and then back up, freeing prisoners as they went, causing the largest jailbreak the place had ever seen. For all his effort, Luffy was too late. By the time he clawed his way through, Ace had already been taken away, moved to the Navy's great fortress where the execution would happen. So Luffy and his ragged group of escaped prisoners burst out of the prison and raced across the sea toward that fortress, throwing themselves straight into what was about to become the largest battle the world had ever witnessed. Whitebeard, Ace's captain, had not abandoned the boy he loved like a son.
He had come with his entire crew and a vast fleet of allied pirates to tear his commander free. Waiting for them stood the full strength of the Navy, every soldier they could muster, their three mightiest commanders, and the warlords who served the government. When the two sides crashed together, the sea itself seemed to break apart. Ice and fire and cannon fire filled the air. It was less a battle than the end of the world, fought across a frozen bay in front of the whole watching world. There was one more cruel twist waiting on that battlefield, hidden among the rows of Navy officers. One of the highest and most respected heroes of the Navy, a famous old fighter feared across every sea, was Luffy's own grandfather. The old man had raised both boys himself when they were small, leaving them with those mountain bandits and dreaming, in his stubborn way, of one day turning them into proud Navy men. Instead, both of his grandsons had grown into pirates, and now he was forced to sit among his fellow officers and watch one of them kneel in chains awaiting death, while the other came charging in to stop it. The old hero was torn straight down the middle, his duty pulling one way and his love pulling the other, and the pain on his face was plain for anyone who looked. Family and war had collided in the worst possible place. Luffy threw himself into that chaos with no thought for himself at all. He was far weaker than almost everyone on that battlefield, a young pirate among legends. Yet he refused to stop moving toward the high platform where Ace knelt in chains. He was struck down again and again and kept rising. During the fight, the Navy's leader announced to the entire world the truth of who Luffy was, that he was the son of the most wanted man on the planet, the leader of a hidden army that dreamed of overthrowing the government itself. The crowd reeled at the news. And then, surrounded and about to be overwhelmed, Luffy unleashed something even he did not fully understand. A sudden blast of pure willpower so strong that it knocked out a huge wave of soldiers all at once, dropping them where they stood without him laying a hand on them. Only a tiny handful of people in all the world were born able to do such a thing. It was said to be the mark of a true king. The watching commanders took careful note. This boy, beaten and bleeding, carried something rare and dangerous inside him. With the help of countless allies who spent their lives to clear his path, Luffy finally reached the platform. He broke Ace free of his chains. For one shining, impossible moment, it seemed the brothers had won. They stood back to back, fighting their way toward escape, the older one and the younger one together at last. The watching world held its breath, daring to hope. Then it all came undone in an instant. One of the Navy's strongest commanders, a merciless man who could turn his own body into burning, molten lava, taunted Ace as he fled, insulting the captain Ace loved. Ace could not let it stand. He turned back to fight. The lava man struck at him with a killing blow, but the strike was aimed past Ace, straight at Luffy, who was too exhausted to dodge. In that single heartbeat, Ace threw himself in the way. He took the blow meant for his little brother through his own body, shielding Luffy with his life. Ace died in Luffy's arms, there on the battlefield, with the whole world watching. His last moments were not spent cursing his fate or his killers. With his final breath, he thanked Luffy, and he thanked the crew and the captain who had taken him in. He said that being loved by them, and having a brother like Luffy, was the only thing he had ever truly wanted, and that he was glad to have lived it all. Then he was gone, and Luffy held the still body of his big brother as the war raged on around them. Something inside Luffy shattered. The boy who never stopped, who always laughed, who always charged forward, simply broke. He went silent and empty, his eyes blank, his body limp, unable to move or fight or even think. The grief was so total that it shut him down completely. He would have died right there, frozen and defenseless in the middle of the war, if a kind fishman named Jinbei had not scooped him up and carried him away from the fighting, shielding the broken boy with his own body and pulling him out of the slaughter. The war ground on toward its terrible end, and the old Captain Whitebeard would not leave the battlefield while his children still needed cover to escape. He had always called the members of his huge crew his sons, and he had come to this war and given his life for one of them. Even mortally wounded, riddled with injuries, the strongest man in the world stayed on his feet to hold back the Navy so the others could flee. The treacherous pirate who had handed Ace over fell upon him with his own gang and struck him down at last. The old giant died standing tall, never once falling to his knees, his body covered in wounds yet still upright. With his final breath, he roared a message to the entire watching world, telling everyone that the great treasure left behind by the Pirate King was real, that it truly existed out there waiting to be found. Those words lit a fire in the heart of every pirate who heard them, and sent a chill through the rulers of the world. Because the dream they most wanted to kill had just been set ablaze all over again. The killing might have gone on even longer, but at the height of it, a familiar figure arrived to stop it. Shanks, the red-haired pirate who had given Luffy his hat all those years ago, stepped onto that blood-soaked battlefield and demanded that the fighting end. Such was his power and his reputation that both sides actually listened. The Great War finally drew to a close, and the man who had set Luffy on his path was the one who brought it to an end, though the two of them never even saw each other in the chaos. In the days that followed, Luffy was a hollow shell. The full weight of losing Ace crashed down on him once he woke, and he came apart, screaming and sobbing, unable to bear it. He had charged into the deepest prison and the greatest war in the world, and despite everything, he had still failed to save the one he had come to save. The pain of that was almost more than he could carry. It was Jinbei who slowly pulled him back from the edge. The fishman would not let Luffy drown in his grief. He reminded the broken boy of a simple truth he had forgotten. Ace was gone, yes, and that wound would never fully heal. But Luffy had not lost everything. He still had a whole crew of friends, scattered across the world, alive and waiting. People who loved him and would come back to him. He still had family left to protect. That single thought was the thread Luffy grabbed onto to climb out of the dark. Even in the middle of all this loss, the world's rulers were doing their cold arithmetic. The boy had broken into their most secure prison, fought through their greatest war, shown a rare and frightening force of will in front of everyone, and been revealed as the son of their most hated enemy. A pirate like that could not be allowed to keep a small price on his head, so they raised it, lifting his bounty from 300 million all the way to 400 million. The number climbed even as Luffy himself lay shattered by defeat, because the danger he represented had grown clearer than ever. In the eyes of the world, he stopped being a mere rookie that day. He became a serious, seasoned threat, a name spoken with real fear. The strange thing about that moment in Luffy's life is how it sat right at the meeting point of his lowest fall and his greatest growth. He had lost his brother. He had been forced to face, in the most brutal way possible, just how far below the top of the world he truly stood. He had learned that wanting to protect someone with all your heart means nothing if you do not have the strength to back it up. That lesson cut deeper than any wound, and it changed the direction of everything that came next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Lying there in his grief, slowly piecing himself back together, Luffy made a choice that surprised everyone who knew him. Every part of him ached to rush off at once and gather his scattered crew, to hold his family close again as fast as he could. He did not do it. He had felt on that battlefield exactly how weak he still was. Weak enough to lose the person he loved most while standing right beside him. He refused to ever feel that helpless again. So instead of running back to his friends, Luffy would soon make the hardest decision of his journey so far. He would tell them, in secret, to wait for him, and then he would vanish completely, disappearing for 2 long years to be trained by the one living man who had once stood at the right hand of the Pirate King himself. All so that he would return strong enough to protect every single person he loved. Section 7. The Boy Who Learned to Wait. Grief is a strange and heavy thing, and it sat on Luffy for a long time after the war. The loss of his brother had cracked something open in him, and the wound did not close quickly. As he slowly came back to himself on the island of women where he was recovering, a hard and quiet truth settled into his heart. He had charged into the greatest battle in the world to save the person he loved most, and his own strength had not been enough. People had spent their lives to clear a path for him, and still Ace had died right in front of him. For all his courage, Luffy had been too weak when it mattered the most. That thought would not leave him alone. The Luffy from the beginning of the journey might have ignored that lesson, dried his tears, and rushed straight off to find his scattered crew, certain that everything would somehow work out. The boy who came out of that war was different. He had been changed by what he saw. He understood now, in a way he never had before, that loving people was not the same as being able to keep them safe. The deadliest half of the sea still lay ahead of him, ruled by the 4 most powerful pirates alive, and he knew that if he sailed into it as he was, he would only watch more of his friends die. He could not let that happen. For the first time in his life, the The most impatient boy in the world chose to stop and prepare. There was one problem. His whole crew was scattered across the globe, each of them waiting for him, and the only plan they had ever made was to regroup quickly if they were ever split apart. If Luffy simply vanished without a word, his friends would search the seas for him and put themselves in terrible danger trying. So he needed to send them a message, one that only they would understand. To do it, he did something almost unthinkable. He secretly slipped back into the very fortress where the war had been fought, the Navy's own stronghold, the most dangerous place in the world for him to be. He went there not to fight, but to grieve. He paid his respects to the fallen, rang the great bell of the fortress in a long, mournful toll, and laid down flowers for the dead. And while the world's cameras caught a glimpse of him, he made sure they could see a message marked on his arm. It was a small thing, just a few letters and numbers, but it spoke directly to his crew. Their old plan had been to meet again in 3 days. Luffy crossed that out and wrote in its place that they should meet again in 2 years. When the photographs spread across the newspapers, each member of the crew, in their separate corner of the world, saw it and understood at once. Their captain was telling them to wait. He was telling them to use this time apart to grow stronger, so that when they finally came back together, they would be ready for whatever the second half of the sea threw at them. One by one, they accepted it. As painful as the wait would be, they trusted Luffy, and they each turned to the hard work of becoming someone worth sailing beside. For Luffy, the work began with a teacher. The old man from the Bubble Island, Rayleigh, the one who had once been the right-hand man of the Pirate King himself, agreed to take Luffy under his wing. He brought the boy to a wild, empty island far from any town, a brutal place full of fierce beasts and harsh weather. And there he began to teach Luffy a hidden power that the strongest fighters in the world all shared. This power lived inside everyone, Rayleigh explained, but only a rare few ever learned to draw it out. It came in 3 forms, and Luffy would need all of them to survive what was coming. The first form was a kind of 6th sense. With it, a fighter could feel the presence of others around him even without seeing them, could sense an enemy hiding nearby, and could even feel an attack coming a split second before it landed, giving him the chance to dodge a blow he had no way of seeing. It was like growing a new set of eyes that looked in every direction at once. The second form was the one Luffy needed most of all. It let a fighter wrap his body in an invisible armor made of pure willpower, hardening his skin to take heavier hits and strike with far greater force. More than that, it solved a problem that had nearly killed Luffy more than once. There were enemies whose bodies could not be touched in the normal way. The Sandman crocodile, long ago in the desert, had crumbled into dust whenever a punch came near him, and Luffy had only beaten him through a lucky trick. The Light Man at the Bubble Island and the Lava Man at the War had bodies that ordinary fists simply passed through. With this invisible armor of will, Luffy could finally land solid hits on such enemies, gripping and striking foes who had once been impossible to touch. That single ability closed a gap that had haunted him through his entire journey. The third form was the rarest of all, the one only a tiny handful of people in the whole world were ever born able to use. It was the same force Luffy had unleashed by accident in the middle of the war, the overwhelming wave of spirit that had knocked out a sea of soldiers without him touching a single one. It was called the power of a king, a force of sheer will so strong it could press down on the weak and drop them where they stood. Luffy had it, raw and wild and uncontrolled. Rayleigh set out to teach him how to wield it on purpose, so that it would obey him instead of bursting out only in moments of desperation. The training was merciless. Day after day, the old master pushed Luffy past every limit he thought he had, throwing him against monstrous beasts and impossible conditions, breaking him down and building him back up stronger each time. Luffy, who had always learned by doing and failing and trying again, threw his whole heart into it. The grief that had nearly swallowed him became fuel. Every time he wanted to quit, he remembered Ace dying in his arms, and he remembered the crew waiting for him out in the world, and he got back up. Slowly, across the long months, the rubber boy who had charged blindly into a war became something far more dangerous. He learned to sense, to harden, and to command the king's force inside him. Across the rest of the world, his friends were doing the same thing in their own ways. Each of them sought out the perfect place or the perfect teacher to fix their weaknesses. The most fitting story of all belonged to the swordsman Zoro. Years before, at the floating restaurant, Zoro had begged to test himself against the greatest swordsman in the world and had been crushed without effort.
Beaten so badly, he swore never to lose again. During these 2 years, Zoro went and found that very same man, the one who had humbled him, and he asked his old conqueror to become his teacher. The greatest swordsman alive agreed, and Zoro trained under him on a lonely island, growing into a blade worthy of standing beside a future pirate king. The others scattered to their own strange corners of the world. One studied the weather among floating sky islands. One learned new ways of fighting in a bizarre, faraway kingdom. One found a place full of futuristic machines and rebuilt his own body stronger. Each chose growth over comfort.
Each kept the promise made silently in those few letters on Luffy's arm. What makes this whole chapter of the story so important is not the new powers themselves, as remarkable as they were. It is the choice behind them. Luffy had spent his entire life refusing to wait for anything. He ran headfirst into every situation, trusting his gut and his fists and his friends to carry him through. The war taught him that some things cannot be solved by charging forward. Becoming someone strong enough to protect the people he loved was going to take time, patience, and pain. And so the boy who never waited learned, at last, to wait. 2 years of his short life, given up so that no one else he cared about would die because he was too weak to stop it. That patience was its own kind of growing up. When the 2 years finally ended, the crew began to gather again at the Bubble Island where they had been torn apart, drifting back to the same place one by one. There were tears and laughter, and the deep relief of a family reunited after so long apart. None of them were the same people who had been scattered. They had each become something more. The world gave them a perfect chance to show it. Almost as soon as they reassembled, the Navy attacked once more, sending in the same kind of powerful human-shaped weapons that had helped crush them 2 years before. The towering soldiers that fired blinding beams and had seemed unbeatable back then. 2 years earlier, those weapons had been part of the nightmare that ended with the whole crew flung across the world. This time was a different story entirely. Luffy walked up to one of the great machines and destroyed it with a single punch wrapped in his new, invisible armor of will, shattering it as easily as glass. Zoro cut another apart in one stroke. Sanji smashed one with a kick. The crew that had once been swept aside like leaves now brushed the same enemies away without breaking a sweat. The change in them was plain for anyone to see. They had gone into the dark, broken and weak, and they had come back out forged into something fierce. With their ship coated and ready, the reunited crew dove down beneath the waves and set their course for the second half of the world. They left behind the calmer waters they had known and pointed themselves toward the most dangerous sea on Earth, the place where only the strongest pirates survived and the 4 mightiest of all ruled like kings. Luffy stood at the front of his ship, his hat on his head, his family around him, stronger and steadier than he had ever been, finally ready to chase the rest of his dream. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The sea they were sailing into did not forgive weakness, and it was about to introduce Luffy to a new kind of enemy. Somewhere ahead, on an island of flowers and fighting rings, ruled a king with a wide, cruel smile, who controlled people the way a puppeteer controls dolls on strings. This smiling king sat at the center of a vast web of crime that touched the whole world, and he held an entire country trapped in fear behind a mask of beauty. Bringing him down would push the price on Luffy's head higher than ever before. It would also hand Luffy something no lone pirate had ever gathered around himself: a true army of loyal followers ready to call him their leader. Section 8. The King Who Pulled the Strings. The second half of the sea opened with a journey straight down. Before they could sail across the new world, the crew first had to dive far beneath the waves, where they found an entire kingdom resting on the ocean floor, a place of fish people and mermaids glowing in the deep. They had adventures there, made friends and enemies, and then rose back up to the surface to enter the most dangerous waters in the world at last. The new world did not ease them in gently. Almost at once they were caught up in strange and terrible events, and along the way they gained an unexpected ally. His name was Law, a calm and clever young pirate close to Luffy's own age, a doctor by training, who fought with a chilling power that let him cut and move things in ways that should not be possible. Law carried a private grudge, a wound from his past tied to a powerful enemy he had sworn to destroy. He came to Luffy with a proposal. Alone, neither of them could topple a foe that large. Together, they might. Luffy agreed, and the two crews formed an alliance. That partnership pointed them toward a beautiful island covered in flowers and ringed by fighting arenas. a place called Dressrosa, ruled by a man who smiled while he crushed everyone beneath him. That man was Doflamingo.
To understand how dangerous he was, you have to understand how many masks he wore at once.
To the public, he was the beloved king of Dressrosa and one of the government's trusted warlords, a hero who had supposedly saved the country. In the shadows, he was something far worse. He had been born into the world's so-called gods, the untouchable nobles, though his family had long since fallen from that high place. He had clawed his way up through cruelty and cunning until he sat at the center of a vast web of crime that stretched across the entire world, secretly trading weapons and dark goods to the most dangerous people alive. He pulled strings everywhere, in more ways than one. Strings were, in fact, his weapon. Doflamingo could create and control thin threads as fine as spider silk and as sharp as razors, strong enough to slice clean through steel and stone. He could string them across the sky to fly. He could whip them out to cut his enemies to ribbons.
Worst of all, he could attach his strings to living people and move them around like puppets on a stage, forcing them to walk, fight, and even attack their own friends against their will.
A man who can turn your own body into his toy is a special kind of nightmare, and Doflamingo had spent his whole life perfecting it. His grip on Dressrosa had been built on a lie, much like the Desert Kingdom long ago, only crueler. Years earlier, he had stolen the throne by tricking the people into hating their own rightful king, then stepped in as the savior of the very mess he had created. From then on, he ruled through fear behind a friendly face. The darkest part of his rule was a hidden horror most of the people did not even know about. One of his followers had a power that could turn a human being into a living toy. Anyone changed this way was not only trapped in a toy's body, they were also erased from everyone's memory.
Their own parents, children, and friends would completely forget they had ever existed at all.
Doflamingo used this to make his enemies vanish without a trace, turning rebels and troublemakers into forgotten playthings, while their families wondered why their hearts ached for someone they could not remember. An entire layer of the country was built on this silent cruelty, hidden beneath the flowers and the cheering crowds. There was an even larger danger humming beneath it all. Doflamingo secretly made and sold twisted, man-made powers and weapons to one of the 4 most powerful pirates in the world, helping that emperor build a monstrous army for some terrible future plan. Breaking Doflamingo would not just free one island, it would yank a vital thread out of a much bigger and darker design, one that would come back to haunt Luffy down the road. When the crew reached Dressrosa, they found a fighting tournament underway, with a prize that stopped Luffy cold. The prize was a firepower, a devil fruit, and not just anyone. It was the very same fire ability that had once belonged to his dead brother Ace. In this world, when the eater of a devil fruit dies, the power does not die with them. It reappears somewhere, waiting inside a new fruit. Ace's flame had come back into the world, and now it was being offered up as a prize for warriors to brawl over. Luffy could not bear the thought of his brother's power falling into the hands of someone cruel, so he threw himself into the tournament to win it back and keep it safe. What he found in that arena broke his heart open and healed a piece of it at the same time. Fighting among the warriors was a young man Luffy recognized, someone he had mourned as dead since they were small children. His name was Sabo, and long ago he had been the third of their little band of brothers. As boys, Luffy, Ace, and Sabo had grown up together in the forest, 3 orphans who swore to be brothers and dreamed of the sea. Sabo had been thought killed when they were children, lost in a tragedy that had scarred Luffy and Ace both. He had survived, though, his memory damaged, and had grown up to become a leader in the hidden army that fought to overthrow the government. The same army led by Luffy's own father. The 2 brothers, each believing the other to be a stranger at first, finally recognized one another in that fighting ring. Sabo took Luffy's place in the tournament so that Luffy could go on to face Doflamingo. He fought his way to victory and claimed Ace's firepower for himself. In doing so, Sabo took up the flame of their fallen brother and made it his own, carrying Ace's spirit forward instead of letting it die a second time. For Luffy, who still carried the raw grief of watching Ace die, seeing his living brother rise up holding Ace's fire was a comfort beyond words. The brothers were not all together again, and never could be, but a piece of Ace lived on in Sabo's hands. The battle for Dressrosa grew enormous. Luffy and his allies fought to reach and destroy the source of Doflamingo's power, racing to knock out the follower whose ability turned people into toys. When that follower finally fell, the spell broke across the entire country in a single instant. Every toy turned back into the person they had once been, and every memory came flooding back at the same moment. Families suddenly remembered the loved ones they had lost. The whole island gasped awake to the truth all at once, and the people, now seeing exactly what had been done to them, rose up in fury against the king who had stolen their lives and their memories. Doflamingo did not go quietly. In a final act of spite, he stretched an enormous cage of his strings all the way around the island, sealing everyone inside, and set it slowly closing in to crush them. He forced the trapped people into a deadly game meant to turn them against each other, intending to wipe the whole country clean and start over. The only way to stop the closing cage was to beat the man controlling it, and that fell to Luffy. The fight against Doflamingo pushed Luffy further than he had ever gone. Even with all his training, the Smiling King was a monster of strength and skill, and ordinary attacks were not enough to bring him down. So Luffy reached for something new. He poured his invisible armor of will deep into his rubber body and pumped himself full of air until he swelled up huge, bouncing through the sky and striking with the force of cannon fire, every punch carrying the weight of his hardened spirit behind it. He called this new form his fourth gear, and it let him finally trade blows with the king on equal footing. Their battle shook the island. Luffy was beaten down, exhausted past the point most people could even stand, and he kept getting up, the way he always did. In the end, he landed a final, earth-shaking blow that drove Doflamingo down for good and shattered the great cage of strings, setting the whole island free. The fall of Doflamingo sent shockwaves rolling across the entire world. He had been a hidden pillar holding up a huge portion of the world's secret crime, and with him gone, that whole dark network shuddered and cracked. The powerful people who had relied on him panicked. The government, the underworld, and the emperors of the sea all felt the ground move. And of course, the price on Luffy's head climbed once more. It rose from 400 million to 500 million, marking him clearly as one of the most dangerous rising pirates in the world. A young man who had now toppled a second warlord and broken something far larger in the process. Something else came out of Dressrosa, something Luffy had never sought and did not quite know what to do with. Throughout the long battle, he had freed and inspired warriors from many different crews, fighters who had been trapped, cursed into toys, or living under Doflamingo's heel. When it was all over, 7 of those crews came together and knelt before Luffy, swearing themselves to him. They declared that they would follow him, that they would come running to his aid whenever he called, no matter where in the world he was. Altogether, these 7 crews numbered more than 5,000 people. Luffy, embarrassed and uncomfortable with the whole thing, tried to wave it off and tell them he was not their boss. They would not hear it. From that day, whether he liked it or not, Luffy was no longer simply the captain of a small crew of friends. He had become the head of a grand fleet, a leader with thousands of loyal pirates ready to fight and die at his word. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The boy who had set sail alone in a tiny boat now had an army at his back and a name that made the powerful nervous. His dream felt closer than ever as the crew sailed away from the freed island. But trouble was already waiting for one of his own. The cook, Sanji, carried a buried past he had spent his whole life running from. A dark and powerful family that had never let him go. That family was about to reach out and drag him back into a world of cruelty and forced marriage and old wounds. To get his friend back, Luffy would do exactly what he had always done for the people he loved. He would march straight into danger without a second thought. And this time, that danger was the home territory of one of the 4 most powerful pirates alive. A fearsome ruler whose land of sweets and smiles hid a temper that could level islands. Section 9. The birth of the 5th Emperor. Every member of Luffy's crew carried some old wound, and the cook, Sanji, had buried his deeper than most. Long before he ever picked up a knife in a kitchen, Sanji had been born into a powerful and frightening royal family that ruled a small, warlike nation and commanded a feared army for hire. His father and his brothers were cold, cruel people who had been changed before birth to feel almost nothing. No fear, no pity, no love. Sanji had been born different. He still felt things deeply, he still cared about others, and for that, his family treated him as a failure and a disgrace. As a small boy, he was mocked, beaten, and locked away in shame. He managed to escape, ran away to sea, and was taken in by the gruff old cook who raised him and taught him everything. For his entire life since, Sanji had hidden his royal name and pretended that family did not exist. He wanted nothing to do with them ever again. The past, though, has a way of reaching out for people who run from it. One of the four most powerful pirates in the world, an enormous and terrifying woman known as Big Mom, ruled a sprawling land made of sweets and candy. She wanted an alliance with Sanji's powerful family and their army, and to seal that alliance, she arranged a marriage. One of her many daughters would wed Sanji, joining the two houses together. What almost no one knew was that Big Mom had no intention of honoring the deal. She planned to use the wedding as a trap to slaughter Sanji's entire family at the altar and steal their military secrets for herself. Sanji's father forced him back into this nightmare by threatening the people Sanji loved, and so the cook made the hardest choice of his life. He left the crew to protect them, and to push Luffy away for good, he even raised his hands against his own captain, beating him in the street and telling him to forget he ever existed. Most people, beaten and rejected by a friend they had come to save, would have taken the hint and left. Luffy was not most people. He understood at once that Sanji had not turned on him out of hatred. Sanji was trapped, cornered by his family and an emperor, doing the only thing he could think of to keep the others safe. Luffy refused to accept it. With only a small handful of his crew and a few brave allies, he marched straight into Big Mom's territory to bring his cook home, walking into the lair of one of the most dangerous people in the world for the sake of one friend. The woman who ruled that land was a force of nature. Big Mom stood taller than a house, with strength enough to shatter buildings with her bare hands. Her devil fruit let her reach into people and pull the very years of life out of anyone who feared her, draining away their time and using it to fuel her own monstrous power. She had even brought a few objects to life by placing stolen souls inside them, so that she fought alongside a living ball of fire that floated like a small sun, a living storm cloud that crackled with lightning, and a talking sword. The most dangerous thing about her was her temper. Whenever she craved a certain food and could not have it, she lost all control and flew into a blind rage, smashing through everything and everyone in her path, even her own people, until the craving was satisfied. An emperor who could level an island over a missing dessert is not an enemy anyone takes lightly. When Luffy finally reached Sanji, the cook still tried to drive him off, insisting that he had chosen his family and his fate. Luffy answered in the simplest way he knew. He sat down and refused to leave. He had not eaten in some time and was weak with hunger, surrounded by enemies, with no good way out, and still he declared that he would not move from that spot until Sanji came back to the crew. He told his friend, plainly, that he would rather starve right there than sail away and leave Sanji behind. Hearing his captain say he would sooner die than abandon him cracked something open in Sanji. The cook, who had spent his whole life being told he was worthless, unwanted, and unloved, stood in front of a man who was willing to waste away rather than lose him. Sanji broke down. He cooked Luffy a meal with shaking hands, fed his starving captain, and wept. And in that moment, he chose his true family over the one that had only ever hurt him. He was coming home. Getting home was another matter entirely. The crew had become tangled in a desperate plot to kill Big Mom during the wedding, working alongside some of her own children who hated her and a few unlikely allies. One of those allies was a face Luffy knew well, the fishman Jinbei, the very one who had carried Luffy out of the Great War and pulled him back from his grief, had been serving under Big Mom. Now he chose to cut himself free of the Emperor and stand with Luffy instead, a betrayal that put a target on his back and nearly cost him his life. He did it anyway, because he had decided his place was with Luffy, and in time he would fully join the crew as one of their own. The plot against Big Mom fell apart in a storm of chaos, and the rescue turned into a frantic escape. The entire crew, along with their allies, had to flee for their lives across Big Mom's territory, while the furious Emperor and her huge family of powerful children chased after them. Big Mom herself, set off by the loss of a special cake she had been promised, fell into one of her terrible rampages, tearing across the sea after them like a living disaster. The crew survived that part only through cleverness and sacrifice. Sanji, using everything his old teacher had taught him, baked a cake so unbelievably delicious that it actually calmed the raging Emperor and bought them precious time. And one of their brave animal warrior allies, a noble fighter named Pedro, gave up his own life in a blast meant to clear the crew's path to freedom, dying so that his friends could escape. His sacrifice was not forgotten. While the others fled toward the open sea, one battle still had to be fought, and it became the heart of everything. Big Mom's strongest and most feared son, a towering, scarf-wearing warrior named Katakuri, stood in Luffy's way. Katakuri was something close to a legend among Big Mom's family. He had never once been beaten, never once been knocked off his feet in battle, and his price was set above 1 billion coins, higher than almost anyone Luffy had ever faced. He carried 2 terrifying gifts. The first was a sticky, stretchy body, much like Luffy's own rubber, that let him reshape himself and strike from any angle. The second was even worse. Katakuri could see a few moments into the future.
In the middle of a fight, he could glimpse what his opponent was about to do before they did it, and so he dodged every attack and countered every move as if he already knew the outcome. Fighting a man who can see the future is almost like fighting fate itself. Luffy ended up trapped with Katakuri inside a strange reflective realm reached through mirrors, cut off from the others while they made their escape. There, the two of them fought one of the longest and most grueling duels of Luffy's entire life. At first, it went terribly. Katakuri read Luffy like an open book, sidestepping every blow and battering him down again and again. Luffy could not land a single meaningful hit on a man who saw each punch coming before it was thrown. He was beaten bloody, knocked down over and over, and by every measure he should have lost. What Luffy did instead was grow, right there in the middle of the fight. Slowly, painfully, through sheer stubborn will and countless failures, he began to develop the very same future sight that made Katakuri so unbeatable. Pushed to the edge of his limits, his sixth sense sharpened until he too could feel a few moments into what was coming, until he could finally start to dodge Katakuri's strikes and land his own. The fight that had been hopelessly one-sided became an even clash between two fighters who could both see ahead. Luffy pushed his ballooning fourth gear further than ever, trading blows with the strongest commander of an emperor's crew. There was honor in Katakuri too, which made the battle even more memorable. At one point, when Luffy was badly hurt and the fight had become unfair, Katakuri wounded himself on purpose to even the odds, refusing to win against an enemy who could not fight back properly. He was a warrior worthy of respect, and Luffy came to respect him deeply even as they tried to break each other apart. The duel raged on until both men were nearly destroyed, standing on willpower alone. And then, at the very end, Luffy did what no one in the world had ever done. He struck Katakuri down and laid him flat on his back, defeating the undefeated, beating the strongest son of an emperor in a fair and brutal fight. That victory was the one that changed everything in the eyes of the world. The crew escaped Big Mom's territory at last, battered and exhausted but alive, having walked into the home of one of the 4 most powerful pirates on Earth and walked back out. They had not killed Big Mom. They had not conquered her land. What they had done was survive her, defy her, beat her greatest warrior, and slip free, which was almost unheard of. When the news of all this reached the wider world, it landed like a thunderclap. The great newspaper of the seas spread the story everywhere, laying out everything Luffy had done in a single breathtaking list. He had toppled a warlord and freed an entire country. He had gathered 7 crews and over 5,000 followers under his banner. He was the sworn brother of the dead son of the Pirate King, and of a leader in the army that fought the government. He was the son of the most wanted man in the world. He had now marched into an emperor's territory and brought down her strongest fighter. Looking at all of that piled together, the world reached a stunning conclusion. People began to call Luffy the 5th Emperor of the Sea, ranking him almost alongside the 4 titans who ruled the New World. The boy from the sleepy village was now being spoken of in the same breath as the most powerful pirates alive. The government answered the only way it knew how. The price on Luffy's head exploded upward, leaping all the way to 1.5 billion coins, 3 times what it had been before. It was a staggering number, a sum that marked him as one of the most dangerous people on the planet. When Luffy first saw his new poster, he actually misread the enormous figure and burst into tears, convinced for a moment that his bounty had somehow dropped, before the truth sank in that it had soared higher than he ever imagined. The misunderstanding gave his crew a good laugh, but the meaning underneath it was no joke at all. Luffy had crossed another threshold. He was no longer a rising rookie or even just a famous pirate. He was now seen as a genuine emperor-level threat, a young man the strongest forces in the world had to take seriously. It is worth sitting with how far he had come. The same boy who once earned a tiny reward of 30 million for beating a fishman in a forgotten corner of the sea was now valued at 1.5 billion, hunted as a near equal of the most fearsome pirates alive. He had done it not by chasing power for its own sake, but again and again by refusing to abandon the people he loved. He had declared war on the world for Robin. He had charged into a war for Ace. And now he had walked into an emperor's home for Sanji. Every great leap in his legend had been built on that same simple, stubborn loyalty Shanks had planted in him as a child. Strength, for Luffy, had always been a thing you used to protect the people who mattered, and the stronger he grew, the more people he could shield. Still, being called the Fifth Emperor was a name handed to him by others, a title built on what he had survived and resisted, rather than on any throne he had truly claimed. He had escaped Big Mom. He had not yet stood toe-to-toe with a real emperor and won. Deep down, that distinction still hung over him. To truly stand among the rulers of the sea, to make the title real rather than borrowed, he would have to do something no one had managed in a very long time. He would have to defeat one of the 4 emperors outright, in a fair fight, on the emperor's own ground. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That challenge was waiting for him just over the horizon, in the most dangerous place he had ever set his sights on. There was a closed-off island nation, sealed away from the rest of the world, suffering for years under the iron grip of an emperor said to be the single strongest creature alive. A monstrous figure who had survived every attempt to kill him and had never once lost a one-on-one battle. To free that land and its people, Luffy would have to charge headlong into the home of the most powerful enemy he had ever faced. And in the fire of that impossible fight, when he was pushed past death itself, the deepest secret of his own power, the true nature of the strange fruit he had swallowed as a small boy in that quiet village so long ago, was finally going to wake up and reveal itself to the world. Section 10. The Awakening of the Sun God. Far from the open sea, hidden behind towering waterfalls and a wall of crashing waves, there was a country that had cut itself off from the rest of the world. It was called Wano, a land of old castles, cherry trees, and proud warriors who fought with swords. For years, it had been a closed kingdom, its borders sealed, its people forbidden from leaving or letting outsiders in. Once, it had been a beautiful and honest place. By the time Luffy arrived, it had become something much darker. The land was ruled by a cruel leader who had betrayed and murdered the country's beloved lord long ago. And behind that ruler stood a far greater power, one of the 4 emperors of the sea, who had taken Wano for himself. That emperor had turned the country into a poisoned factory. The rivers ran foul, the skies hung gray with smoke, and the food was tainted, so that ordinary people starved and sickened while the rulers feasted behind their walls. The emperor had built enormous weapons works and an army of beast-like soldiers, many of them given their twisted half-animal powers by the very same man-made fruits that the Smiling String King had once secretly produced and sold. The thread Luffy had cut by defeating that String King long ago led directly here, to the heart of an emperor's war machine. Wano was the place where all of it had been heading. The emperor who ruled this misery was named Kaido, and the world had given him a fearsome title. They called him the strongest creature in the world. He could turn himself into an enormous dragon, vast enough to blot out the sky, breathing destruction across the land. More chilling than his strength was a rumor that followed him everywhere. Kaido was said to be impossible to kill. Over his long, violent life, he had been captured, tortured, dropped from terrible heights, and struck with weapons that should have ended anyone. And through all of it, he had simply refused to die. He had even tried to end his own life many times out of sheer boredom and despair, and failed every time. An enemy who cannot be killed is a special kind of mountain to climb. Hope in Wano did not come from outsiders alone. For years, a small band of loyal samurai, the faithful retainers of the good lord who had been executed, had been quietly planning a rebellion. They had waited, gathered allies, and trained in secret, all for a single night when they would rise up and try to free their country. The Lost Lord's young son carried his father's dream forward, and these warriors carried his will. Into their plan stepped Luffy and his crew, along with 2 other young pirate captains who had risen up through the seas alongside him, the calm Dr. Law and the fierce, proud Kid. Together, pirates and samurai joined hands for one desperate goal. They would storm the Emperor's island fortress and bring him down, freeing Wano and its people once and for all. Luffy, being Luffy, very nearly ruined everything by charging in too soon. Before the rebellion was ready,
He could not stand by while the Emperor's men abused the starving people in front of him, so he attacked Kaido head-on, alone, far too early. The result was humbling in the worst way. Kaido struck him a single time, and that one blow flattened Luffy completely, knocking him out cold. The strongest creature in the world had beaten the rising Fifth Emperor with one casual hit, then had him dragged off and thrown into a prison camp like nothing at all. It was a brutal reminder that the title the world had given Luffy was still only borrowed. Against a true emperor, he was not yet ready. What Luffy did with that defeat is what mattered. Locked in the prison camp, surrounded by other beaten and starving prisoners, he did not sit and sulk. He found an old, wise fighter among the prisoners and threw himself into training all over again, hungry to close the gap between himself and Kaido. There he learned to push his invisible armor of will to a level he had never reached before. Instead of merely hardening his skin and his fists, he learned to send that force straight through an enemy's body, striking their insides without even breaking the surface, like ringing a bell inside a wall of steel. It was a way to hurt a foe so tough that ordinary blows simply bounced off. Luffy drilled it over and over, on the very beastmen who guarded the camp, until he could do it at will. Then he broke out, stronger than he had gone in, and rejoined the rebellion. The great night finally came. During a huge festival on the Emperor's Island fortress, the rebels and their pirate allies launched their raid, pouring into the stronghold to take down Kaido and the cruel ruler who served him. The battle that followed was enormous, sprawling across every level of the fortress, thousands of fighters clashing at once. To make matters even more dangerous, Kaido had joined forces with another of the four emperors, the very same towering woman Luffy had barely escaped before, the ruler of the Land of Sweets. Now both of those titans stood on the same island. The two other young captains, Law and Kid, took it upon themselves to face the Sweets Emperor together, freeing Luffy to set his sights on the dragon. Luffy's road to Kaido was paved with failure, again and again. He reached the Emperor and fought him with his new inside striking power, and for a while he held his own better than before. Then Kaido overwhelmed him once more and beat him down. In one clash, Luffy was knocked clean off the top of the fortress and sent plummeting into the freezing sea far below, where, unable to swim, he came within a breath of drowning. He was rescued, pulled from the water, healed, and sent back up to try again. Each time he fell, he learned something. Each time he rose, he was a little harder to put down. Between those rounds, Luffy unlocked yet another piece of the puzzle. He learned to take the rare king's force of will, the same overwhelming power he had first shown by accident at the Great War, and wrap it around his attacks, so that his strikes carried that crushing pressure into the enemy. Only a tiny handful of fighters in all the world could do such a thing, and they were almost all emperors themselves. With this, Luffy climbed back to the rooftop of the fortress and faced Kaido yet again, trading blows that shook the whole island and lit up the night sky. He was closer now, close enough to truly hurt the strongest creature in the world. Still, it was not quite enough. Kaido, for all the damage he took, kept standing, and in the end, he struck Luffy down once more. Then came the moment that should have ended everything. In one final, devastating exchange, with the help of a traitor in the shadows, Kaido landed a blow so terrible that Luffy's heart simply stopped. The young captain fell, and his heartbeat went silent. To everyone watching, to the samurai and the crew and the suffering people of Wano, it looked as though their last hope had died on that rooftop. The Dragon Emperor stood victorious over the still body of the boy who had dared to challenge him. The night seemed lost. What happened next had been hidden, waiting, since the day a small boy in a quiet village swallowed a strange fruit by accident and complained about the taste. In the silence where Luffy's heartbeat should have been, a single beat returned, then another. They came back not in a normal rhythm, but in a strange rolling pattern, like the pounding of drums echoing out across the whole battlefield. The sound grew louder, steadier, almost joyful, a beat that seemed to carry freedom in it. Luffy's body, broken and dying a moment before, filled with a strange new power and lifted itself back up. He stood, and he had changed completely. His hair and his clothes had turned pure white, a soft cloud of smoke curling around his shoulders. And across his face was a wide, delighted grin, as if some great and ancient joy had woken up inside him. The truth of his power finally came clear, the secret the whole world had been kept from for centuries. The fruit Luffy had eaten as a child had never been a simple rubber fruit at all. For his entire life, everyone had called it the gum-gum fruit, and thought of it as a minor, almost silly power. In reality, it was one of the rarest and most legendary fruits ever to exist. Long, long ago, in the age the world's rulers had worked so hard to erase, there had been a figure remembered by the poor and the enslaved as the sun god, a warrior named Nika. He was a being of pure freedom and laughter, who, the stories said, would appear to those who were suffering, free them from their chains, and make them smile again. He was a symbol of hope for everyone the powerful had ground down. The fruit Luffy carried held that very spirit. The world government feared the legend of Nika so deeply that they had spent 800 years trying to wipe it from history. They had hidden the fruit, hunted those who spoke of it, and even given the fruit a plain, false name so that no one would ever realize what it truly was. They wanted the very idea of a god of freedom forgotten forever, because freedom was the one thing their entire rule could not survive. And all that time, without knowing it, Luffy had carried that spirit inside him. It explains so much about who he had always been. It explained why he could never stand to see anyone in chains, why he freed every oppressed person he met, why his heart bent always toward laughter and toward setting others loose. He had been living out the will of the sun god his whole life, long before he ever knew the name. In this awakened form, his strongest and freest of all, Luffy could bend the world around him as if it had become as stretchy and playful as his own rubber body. He could make the solid ground bounce beneath his enemy like a trampoline. He could grow himself to the size of a mountain. He could grab a bolt of lightning out of the air and swing it like a whip. He fought now with a wild, cartoon-like joy, laughing as he went, as though the deadliest battle of his life had turned into the greatest game he had ever played. The fight that had crushed him so many times suddenly tilted in his favor, because the rules themselves seemed to bend to his imagination. The final clash between Luffy and Kaido was the largest and most spectacular battle of his entire journey. The two of them rose into the sky above the fortress, trading blows so powerful that the whole island shook and the clouds split apart. Kaido, who had never once lost a one-on-one fight, threw everything he had at the white-clad, grinning warrior, and for the first time in his long life, found himself being pushed back. Luffy met the dragon's strongest attacks with that same impossible joy, turning Kaido's own force back against him, growing huge, striking with the weight of the heavens. At the very end, gathering all his power into one final, enormous fist, Luffy drove the strongest creature in the world down through the roof of his own fortress, down through every level beneath it, and deep into the earth far below, defeating him at last. The Dragon Emperor fell, and Wano was free. The two other captains, Law and Kid, won their own battle as well, bringing down the Sweets Emperor in the depths of the island. When the sun rose over Wano that morning, the impossible had happened. Two of the four emperors of the sea, two of the most powerful and feared pirates in the entire world, had been defeated in a single night, on the same island, by a band of pirates and samurai who refused to give up. The poisoned land began to heal. The starving people wept with relief. The lost lord's son took his rightful place, and the country that had been sealed in misery for so long finally breathed free air again. The shock of it rolled across the whole world like a tidal wave. The fall of two emperors in one night shook the balance of power everywhere. Kings and admirals and pirates alike scrambled to understand what it meant. And when the dust settled, the world reached a conclusion that had been building for a long time. With Kaido and the Sweets Emperor toppled, the ranks of the four most powerful pirates alive had to be filled again, and Luffy's name was placed among them. This time, the title was not a nickname handed out by a gossiping newspaper. It was real, recognized by the government and the whole world. The boy from the sleepy village had become a true emperor of the sea, one of the four mightiest pirates on the planet, standing where only the most fearsome legends had ever stood. To mark it, the government set the price on his head at a staggering 3 billion coins. Sitting with that number for a moment shows the whole arc of his rise. When he first sailed out of his quiet harbor and beat a fishman in a forgotten corner of the world had valued him at 30 million. Now, after everything, that number had grown 100 times over, 30 million to 3 billion. From a small-time rookie nobody had heard of to one of the four rulers of the sea, hunted as one of the most dangerous people alive. Few pirates in all of history had ever climbed so high so fast. What makes the climb so worth remembering is that Luffy never chased the power itself. Every single leap upward had come from the same simple place planted in him as a child. He grew strong to protect Nami and free her village. He declared war on the world to save Robin. He stormed a war and broke his own heart trying to save his brother. He walked into an emperor's home for Sanji, and he toppled the strongest creature in the world to free an entire suffering country full of strangers. The will of the sun god and the lessons of a red-haired pirate had pointed in exactly the same direction all along. Strength was never the goal. Strength was the tool he used to set people free, and the freer he made others, the higher he himself rose. Far away, on his own ship, the red-haired pirate who had started it all picked up the newspaper that announced Luffy had taken down Kaido and joined the Four Emperors. He looked at the face of the boy he had given his hat to so many years ago, the reckless child he had nearly lost to the sea, now grown into one of the most powerful pirates in the world, and he smiled, full of pride, remembering the small village, the borrowed straw hat, and the promise they had made to meet again one day, when Luffy had become a great pirate. That day was no longer a distant dream. It was coming close. The hat still sat on Luffy's head through all of it. The same straw hat that had once belonged to the Pirate King, passed down to the red-haired pirate, and then placed on a crying boy's head as a promise. It had been with him through every fight in this whole story, from the sleepy harbor to the rooftop of a dragon's fortress. It was no cleaner and no fancier than the day he got it. It was simply the most important thing he owned, the weight of a promise he had carried his whole life, and was now, at last, close to fulfilling. Luffy had become an emperor. He had awakened the deepest truth of his own power. He had freed a nation, avenged the suffering of strangers, and earned a place among the strongest pirates alive. By any measure, the boy from the quiet village had risen further than anyone could have imagined when he first pushed his little boat out to sea with nothing but a hat and a dream. His story, though, was far from finished. Becoming an emperor was never the dream itself. It was only the doorway to it. Ahead of him still lay the greatest treasure in the world, the prize left behind by the Pirate King, hidden at the very end of the most dangerous sea of all.
To claim it and earn the title he had promised himself as a child,
Luffy would have to sail into the final and largest stage of his entire journey, a place where the oldest secrets of the world were buried, where the true masters who had ruled from the shadows for 800 years would finally step into the light, and where the hardest, strangest, and most important battles of his life were still waiting for him just beyond the horizon. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.